Hello, and welcome to another episode of Beyond Deming. I am joined today again by Frank Devine, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about rapid mass engagement. Hello, Frank.
Morning, James. Morning.
We've already recorded, and it's worth going back and having a listen, a podcast about the cathedral higher purpose model of leadership. What we thought we'd do today is we would talk about rapid mass engagement, and we would refer back to some questions that we've asked some listeners. So before we start then, Frank, how about you give me an overview of rapid mass engagement? What is it and where did it come from?
And before doing that, James, it'd be nice to just have a little thought experiment for people who may have no knowledge of it at all before going into it. So I want people to imagine the scene. You've just been appointed as a senior director, let's say to a big factory, and you're doing your induction. And part of your induction is to understand the culture of the factory or the section of the organization you're now the senior director of. And so you're probably expecting someone from HR to explain the culture, or maybe the general manager of the site. But actually, the people who are presenting the whole outline of what the culture is are two people from frontline, and they take you through not just what the culture is, but how it was created by them, by the employees, that it wasn't handed down by any previous management. It was agreed between the employees and the senior management through the process we're going to talk about today called rapid mass engagement. Frontline, ordinary non-managerial staff are, first of all, presenting how they as employees own this culture. So it's not something that future management has the right to change. It has been created by all of the workforce, and they'll probably throw in a few jokes. They'll say, you senior guys, you guys come for a couple of years and then you bugger off somewhere else when you get promoted. Whereas we stay and we live this culture, and we want to keep living this culture until the day we leave. Can you imagine the expectation that sets for the senior leader about what that senior leader's behavior needs to be to succeed in this new job that you're walking into? The reason for the thought experiment is that everything else all fits into a system to create that output. So the confidence and the trust that those employees have that this is their culture and their management and them are working together to sustain this all works in a system to create that kind of output and that kind of change. And the other thing it will create for the new director is massive curiosity. And if you like, a desire to learn more about how is this possible? How did this happen? If people are curious, that curiosity creates the openness to think and to explore ideas which previously would be regarded as crazy. So rapid mass engagement and the cathedral model of leadership that's part of it are the result of over 30 years of experimentation with bigger and bigger numbers of people in a wider range of sectors and geographies and cultures. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
So where did it come from to start off with? And so,
the original spark.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it came from naivety and frustration. So my naivety and my frustration. The naivety was because I'd played football at the highest level I could. I thought what worked in sport would be working inside organizations. And what I found was highly hierarchical organizations with often hostile or dismissive attitudes between management, white-collar employees, and blue-collar employees. It's like the old John Cleese thing. The upper class looks down on the middle class, who looks down on the working class. And although John Cleese was being humorous, there was a large element of truth in the caricature, and it went the other way around as well. So the shop floor didn't like the guys in the office. They thought he didn't do any work. You know, they knocked off at 5 o'clock, whereas we're here on shifts, and you know all the usual stuff. It's always the other guys. The other guys are the problem rather than looking inwards. Some of the things I learned in sport worked well, but some of the things didn't, and which was which, and that's an important thing to discover and to know. The other thing was I got rapidly promoted because I got things done, and I got things done quickly. Just my nature. I'm impatient, and people say demanding in terms of standards and stuff. So, but what I noticed was when I look back to the improvements made in previous jobs, I realized a lot of them were not sticking, not sustaining. Some of the cultural aspects plateaued, and in some cases started to go backwards as other managers came in and put their own stamp on things. And also because what I'd left behind wasn't sustainable. It was too dependent on the energy and commitment of a small group of leaders, including myself. And the lesson there is no matter how good you are as a leader, no matter how energetic and committed you are, and no matter how hard working you are, there just aren't enough of you. That the coalition that needs to be built has to be much wider than management.
Yes.
And the ideal coalition is the entire workforce.
Yeah, because I've worked for some great managers in my time, and that's fantastic until they move on.
Yes.
And then the whole thing can fall apart.
Now, I wouldn't claim to be a great manager because the inherent weakness in what I was doing was I was creating things which were not sustainable. It forced me to look inwards and think, instead of just focusing on the results, which were always very good, but at what cost? And how many people did I bring with me? I always brought an enthusiastic group with me. But what about the rest? So I had to retreat a little bit into reflection and learning, and however good we are as leaders, how do we create sustainable systems that survive us?
Two or three frustrations there that you're talking about.
Yeah.
One is that you can be as charismatic as you like as a leader, but it'll only take you so far.
Yes.
The second one is that, and I've experienced this time and time again, culture change doesn't stick. It's linked to the first point, but when somebody moves on, the culture will change. And then the third one really is about getting the most out of the people who are in the organisation, the people who are staying rather than the people who move on.
Yes. The recognition that managers, particularly if you're on a fast track promotion thing in an organisation, you're moving on. What have you left behind? And is what you've left behind sustainable? The objective is to create something that is a culture that is so strong and so owned by the employees with so much commitment that if a senior leader tries to change it, it will cause a major problem and difficulty for that senior leader.
Ahead of this podcast, we actually asked for some questions. One of the questions was, we all know that frontline staff know a lot of the answers because they understand the detail. Why do organisations struggle to listen to that?
I think a lot of people do understand this, but there's a lot of other people as well who pay lip service to believing that. And that second group sometimes can be misleading in that you can get superficial agreement with this kind of approach. But superficial agreement, when faced with real challenges, soon dissipates. So what you're aiming for is that you create so strongly emotional ownership and commitment to the whole process that anyone who's inauthentic is easily spotted because of the rigor of the behavioral standards that are
okay.
built to sustain it. In a situation where feedback and challenge is not only permitted but mandated in order to keep the culture alive, individuals who are not truly understanding of that point, it becomes uncomfortable for them because the number of people giving them feedback from all directions. And if your boss is giving you feedback, your peers are giving you feedback, and people just in the canteen are giving you feedback, you soon say, I don't want to work here anymore, and they will often leave. If fundamentally you don't align, you don't agree with treating employees with that much respect, it's going to show.
Another question we had is, good managers often say, what's stopping you from performing at your best and how can I fix that?
Yes.
So is this the same or is it different to that?
The person asking the question is absolutely right. Looking for feedback, taking on the feedback, adjusting your style and approach to adapt to feedback is how we improve as individual managers. What we're talking about with rapid mass engagement is the entire system operating that way, from top to bottom, left to right, across functions, everybody operating like that. Ideally, no employee will ever worry about who their new boss is because all the bosses are excellent. They won't be roboticized the same, but in terms of the outputs and the way they develop their team, the way they drive standards, the way they lead by example, the way they connect all the dots, they will do all those things. They'll have their own personality, they'll have their own style, but the people working for them will get all of that as part of the package.
So that brings me back to another one of the questions we've got, which was, so this isn't about individual managers, this is much more systematic. The question we've got was, how does this link to large group methods from the systems thinking discipline?
Yeah. Now that particular question referenced Beer and the viable system model. And Beer was coming at this from a different start point. As organizations get more complex and there's just more information and more size and more complexity, a centralized top-down approach cannot handle that. A small group of people in headquarters can't adequately manage the complexity. So you have to create self-sustaining mechanisms at local level. And that's what the viable systems model aims to do. In terms of its link to rapid mass engagement, the difference is that once you've decided in rapid mass engagement what system we're trying to optimize, the issue is how do you make it the whole system aligned, regardless of function, regardless of hierarchy, etc., etc. Beer's approach was a kind of how do we design the systems to do this? And what he's arguing is absolutely true. Rapid mass engagement was more about how do we create a culture of improvement, and in order to do that, some of the things Beer talks about, like distributed power, driving decisions to the lowest level, is maximized in rapid mass engagement.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of similarity, albeit the starting point is very different.
Yeah. Okay. And so one more question then, which is just, how do you stop this becoming just another initiative?
That's an incredibly important question. I mentioned earlier about curiosity. One of the things in the structure of rapid mass engagement is that the entire workforce is divided into diverse workshops in order to avoid groupthink. So you don't have lots of people who do the same jobs in the same workshop. You expose people to lots of different employees doing different jobs in different functions. So they have to listen and understand what it's like for other people, not just be selfish, if you like.
Yeah.
They have to think about the whole system rather than themselves. Initially, when people walk in, they will think it's just another initiative because that's been their experience. So for example, when they realize that the senior leadership team is the only group that is not entitled to put an item on the agenda for the decision-making event called Consensus Day, which creates the joint change plan.
Sends a
Then they think,
powerful message that it's not the same as everything else they've seen.
yeah, usually that's where the power is.
Yes.
And what we've done is we've kind of reversed it. Now, there's still, the senior management team has to agree the whole approach. They have to agree the logistics. There's a whole lot of guardrails around this. But ultimately, when the senior management team walks into Consensus Day, the entire agenda has been created by other people, not them. Ultimately, when the employees have spoken, who makes the decision as to what to do? And inevitably, people say, oh, well, yeah, senior management makes the final decision. Said, well, in this case, they don't. And that's the fundamental difference. It's by consensus, hence the name Consensus Day. So nobody has more power on Consensus Day than anybody else.
So you've explained the culture
Yeah.
behind it, but how does it actually work?
Well, let's look at the three words, because the three words are significant. Rapid is about the pace at which everything happens. Conventionally, we're told repeatedly that culture change is very difficult, true, and it takes a long time. False. Because I believed if it was highly worthwhile and it takes a long time to do, why don't we speed the bloody thing up and do it quicker? And in terms of signaling commitment to the workforce from senior leadership, when the employees see the entire process, they see that in small organizations, the whole culture is going to be codified within 2 weeks, that we're going to have a change plan within 2 weeks that's owned by the workforce, not by senior management, that all the things that they've raised as a priority are going to be addressed. When they see that, they realize that, wow, this is different. And they say, no, this is real. That creates a bow wave effect in the organization, whereby people are now are less skeptical. So therefore, what might take me 2 hours in the early workshops to explain, by the time we get to the end, because of the viral effect, it might only take an hour.
That explains what it is, but how does it work? What's the foundation?
How's it working?
Yeah.
The first step is senior leadership team they'll have visited a location where this has happened, or they've heard about it, or they'll have read my book with all the examples in it and stuff. There'll be some mechanism to trigger the phone call to me. And Frank, we want to do rapid mass engagement. And I'll say, okay, how long is it going to take? What's it going to say? Well, let's not go ahead of ourselves. First of all, you need to understand what it is.
The challenge here isn't so much engaging the staff. The challenge here is much more about getting the managers to back off, isn't it?
It's to get managers to understand, if they sign up for rapid mass engagement, they're signing up to actually having their employees decide the agenda for a change plan.
So, but therefore, by definition, the managers have to give up some control, and they have to be willing to do that.
Yes. And in that, I call it a diagnostic and decision-making day. That's what I call it. Because the diagnosis is, what are you trying to achieve as an organization? Where are you now? Current state. And the preparation for that involves them creating their own data. I don't charge organizations to go in and do diagnoses. I get them to do all the data, and then we diagnose together on that one day. And so, where do you want to be? Where are you? And as part of that, what level of engagement, now not involvement, not employee voice, engagement. So the old thing about the traditional British breakfast, about the bacon and egg. The chicken is involved, but the pig is deeply engaged. Okay, so we need more bacon and less egg in terms of what we're aiming for here, because there is a transfer of power at different stages, and employees are actually making decisions. Traditionally, we treat our employees parent-child. We ask them for their input, but the parents decide where to go on holiday or whatever it is. Here, the whole thing is adult-adult. So employees have to prioritize. You remember when we first had Kaizen events and all the rest of it, the mistakes people make by asking the employees what's wrong, and you get 100 things on a flip chart, and then we tell the engineers to go and fix them. And they just haven't got the capacity, and which is more important. So it's to avoid all of that. So the employees have to prioritize what are the most important obstacles to the organization achieving something called its higher purpose, which I can go into if you want.
Yeah, go on,
later.
Because I think that's quite important.
When I was looking at how do we make it sustained, how do we create a level of ownership that sustains a high-performing culture forever kind of thing, you can't get that purely logically. So the idea is to create a purpose, a reason for doing this, which, like the old Heineken ad, reaches places that any other form of this doesn't reach. So just to give you a practical example, I'm Irish, and in Boston Scientific in Galway is in the west of Ireland, which suffered the greatest population decline after the famine and in the waves of emigration. But the aspect of the higher purpose in Galway, when I was walking around talking to employees, and I used to ask them, which part of the higher purpose meant the most to you? And the ones who were from the west of Ireland said it was creating a future for our family and friends in the West. So in other words, reducing emigration, reducing forced emigration, so families kept together, etc.
But higher purpose is not about creating
Profit.
market share or reducing costs or any of those
No.
normal corporate things.
Yes.
It's much more
Yeah.
a deeply held emotional, if that's the word for it.
That everyone can buy into.
Yes, okay.
Even people who haven't signed up for capitalism can buy into the idea of having a thriving community with jobs and help for local businesses and local schools and all the rest of it. So
who creates this higher purpose? How does that get done?
Well, that's interesting. Usually that would be created by the senior team, but often then socialized among a wider group of leaders, and then it becomes the higher purpose. But in smaller organizations, the workforce itself has created its own higher purpose. And that's more powerful. But if you've got 3,000 employees in a room, you're not going to be able to, it doesn't work in terms of the sheer mechanics of how you debate and create this. It's too difficult a task for a very big group.
So talk me through the sequence then.
It starts with that diagnostic. Yeah. Where are we? Where do we need to go? Three quick questions. What level of employee engagement, as opposed to involvement or what level of engagement is required to achieve that stretch target? This is one of the biggest mistakes organizations make. They have the ambitious stretch target, but the conventional methodologies they're trying to use to get there are just not good. It's not going to be strong enough. So in other words, they've set themselves up for failure So that's an important discussion for that leadership.
But then by definition, they have to realize in that discussion that they are not going to achieve those goals unless they get everybody with them.
Exactly.
So let me just summarize where we're at then in terms of the sequence then. So you start off with a senior team diagnostic day where people understand the gap.
Yes.
What are they trying to achieve? And it's
Yes.
the management team. But the key
Yes.
question is, do they have the wherewithal in their organization to fulfill that gap? And it's only if they come to the conclusion
Yes.
themselves that they need to get everybody lined up and engaged that rapid mass engagement works. Because if they're not prepared to lose that level of control, then you're on the hide until the people have got that right.
Yeah. And now people will naturally hold on to existing processes that they've got running already. So one of the things I try and encourage them to do at this stage is not to start any other initiatives. Think about bandwidth.
So once you've got everybody lined
Yeah.
up at a management level, what happens next?
Yes. We have to create a mechanism for getting the entire workforce through 3-hour workshops as quickly as possible to create the data on which the whole system will be built. So in those workshops, they will decide what's the biggest obstacles to the higher purpose, what stops them doing their job well, if you like, in relation to this higher purpose. They have to prioritize those to stop us having a massive list. And that forces adult prioritization conversations. They then create the behavioural data on which the new culture will be based. So that's the raw experience of life about what's motivated them and what hasn't motivated them through their life. That's collected in the workshop. And then the third big decision they have to make is, who do we send to this consensus day?
But before we move on to the consensus day, then, a couple of questions that people have asked.
Yes,
How do you make
yes,
people feel
yeah.
safe enough to speak honestly about what's working and what's not working?
In the original workshop, there's rules around confidentiality. So I say to them, what we talk about in the workshop, any contribution by any individual stays within these walls. I ask all the people in the room to protect each other by not talking about what anybody says in the workshop. Now, the fact that X has been elected by the workshop is public. You know, we have a little ceremony, we write it on the wall and stuff, and so that's knowledgeable. And what the issues are is made public as well in the agenda for Consensus Day. But what individuals say personally is
Totally off the record.
confidential.
Yeah, okay. So another question we got asked then, Brent, was how do you overcome the problem's not me, it's everybody else, that sort of mindset that you get in organizations?
Yeah. Now that exists both at management and employee level. It's always tempting to point to somebody else and blame somebody else. And that's why the workshops are diverse in the true sense. We're looking for not just diversity in terms of job, but cognitive diversity. People who will disagree with each other. Disagreement is a good thing because that's how we work out what actually is more important than something else. So if we ever get people blaming other people, I say, you know, whenever I've done this, it's always the other shift that's at fault. So really, I could make my job a lot easier if I went back to management and say, it's all right, just fire the other shift. And then they'd say, which shift is that? And they'd say, all of them. So it can't be everybody else's fault. So that lightens it a little bit. And explaining what consensus means as part of the first hour, I explained to them that we will only have consensus on Consensus Day when everybody has deeply listened to and tried to understand where everybody else is coming from. And we won't get to understand where anyone's coming from if we're blaming them.
Yes.
So there's a kind of separate the situation, the problem from the person or the group. and let's talk about the issues rather than hanging anybody out to dry.
So presumably this has got quite a big effect on well-being and how you retain staff and things like that.
Yeah, I mean the evidence on that is pretty overwhelming, just in terms of simple things like the number of complaints, you know, grievances go massively down, absenteeism goes down. If you're making a marginal decision, do I go into work or not? If your work is really meaningful to you and you can see the higher purpose in your work, then you're gonna drag yourself into work. Simple stuff like that. So the idea is to get things sorted, if you like, at the lowest level of the organization, involving as few people as possible. And the efficiency and productivity effect of that is very, very difficult to measure, but there's certainly a correlation between doing this and increases in productivity almost immediately, literally almost immediately.
When I've seen this done in the past, and you touched on it, you just get far too many ideas, far too flipping quickly, and you
Oh
don't
yeah,
have the hope in hell of doing them all. So how do you get around
yeah.
that?
The way we get around that is very simple. Force prioritization. And they grumble like hell about this. And that's, well, we've got to find out what the biggest things are to give us a better chance of them being actually uh, true and reliable. Because don't forget, when we come to implement and debate the change plan, we're going to have to subject all this to data analysis and actual numbers and stuff. So we got to get it right. And what I say to employees is, if we come up with Mickey Mouse stuff that turns out not to be true, what happens to the credibility of employees' input to this? We got to get this right. So we've got to be adult and make decisions. That is more important than anything else. So that's what we're going to put on the agenda.
What you're really saying is a hugely important thing is to get the employees to prioritize their problems.
Yeah, and key is the separation of diagnostics from problem solving. They're explicitly told not to try and problem solve. It's not about suggestions. It's not about ideas for improvement at that stage. Because if you get individual workshops thinking they've got a solution, their ownership will be for that solution. Now, that solution has not been tested against all the other solutions or the data on consensus day. So you don't want to create ownership of the wrong stuff. You want to create ownership of the final change plan agreed on consensus day.
So at this stage, it's really just about getting people to be clear what the obstacles are.
Diagnostic.
Yeah, okay,
Yes.
I understand.
There's only one thing worse than crap, and that's deeply owned crap. So we don't want the emotional commitment behind the wrong stuff. Now, when I say wrong, I don't mean that I'm correcting them or anything. It's the rigor of the analysis, the rigor of the diagnostics has to be there.
So at the end of your all employee workshops, you've got a list of the key issues that they would like to see resolved. And
Yes.
you also have a
Yes.
nominated person or persons who will then go in and to your consensus day events. Is there anything else you get out of that?
And we have the raw behavioral data. The raw behavioral data is the mechanism for transferring what's deeply impacted individuals in their life, not just their work, into a culture for the site. The other thing to be aware of, the senior leadership team at the beginning creates the scope. So what's up for discussion and what isn't? Rapid mass engagement is a power sharing mechanism, and the senior leadership team can't share power they haven't got. So if corporate decides, for example, budgets are already set. Now, in the debate around how to achieve the agreed change plan, at that stage, senior leaders can come in and say things about the next year's budget. But the current year's budget is already established. You can't just create money from nowhere.
So an
Or
example I would give of that, I'm deeply skeptical about any HR performance management process.
yes,
However, it's not something I've ever been in a position
the
to
local team
change.
can't change
So
it.
if you can't change it, you just have to suck it up.
Yes.
But be clear, you just have to suck it up from the get-go.
What I say to people there is, if something's really, really big and it's out of scope, I will take it back to the senior leadership
Yeah.
team. So in Bacardi Martini, the original scope did not include the pay system. But the pay system that had been put in previously was try to engage people by giving them stuff. So they had created a deeply uncompetitive pay system compared to competition. The way they dealt with it was all new employees coming in were on a competitive pay scheme. But that meant the people who were there longer were being paid far more for doing the same job. So normally a pay system would be corporately agreed, corporately determined and out of scope. In the particular circumstances, the senior team was able to commit to a pay working party with a job evaluation process to back it up, whereby the whole pay system was redesigned, but within the existing budgets. So it was a redistribution from one group to the other. And the higher paid guys on the working party voted unanimously for all of the future pay budgets to go to their lower paid colleagues to speed up
The closing of the gap. It was originally off the table, but it was such a big issue that you took it back to the management team and they did actually do something about it.
Yes. Yeah.
So you get to the point where you've been through your all-employee workshop. So the next thing is this consensus day you talk about. So what's that and how does that work?
Well, consensus day is you've got the senior leadership team there as of right. If you remember the old American president explaining why he'd appointed one of his biggest critics into his cabinet, and he said, I'd rather have him inside my tent peeing out than have him outside the tent peeing in. Well, you don't want any member of the leadership team not to feel the emotional commitment behind the change plan. So they've all got to be there. And then you've got all of the people, delegates come representing their workshops with the items that were nominated to their individual workshops. You get overlapping issues nominated. So we combine them together into an agenda. And for all the employees who are not in consensus day, when they get the change plan back, the next day, briefed by employees, not by managers. So again, different from just another initiative, my peer that was at consensus day is now explaining this plan to me, not my boss. You can trace what you said in your workshop so individuals can see that what they said directly links. They can trace it.
What exactly happens in the consensus day? And so you're feeding this agenda.
Yeah, you've got, let's say, biggest one, 95, I think. Big circle. So you don't have rows of people behind each other. Everybody's in the front row. And I'm in the front row as well. And I do some introductions in terms of this is the consensus day we talked about in the workshops, but I remind them of the rules of what consensus means. So in other words, even if we've gone around the room for consensus and 94 of the 95 agree with it, we haven't got consensus. We ask the 95th person, what worry do you have about the proposal? And their answer provides the problem statement for the next problem solving. So that's how it drives. That's why it takes a while to do consensus day.
And then what, you just simply go through the agenda?
Go through the agenda. Yeah. It takes people a while to learn how to do consensus. So the first decision can often take 3 to 4 hours. And that's because people are unsure. Now they've got the senior management in the room. It's not like talking to me in a little workshop. So they can be nervous. I train them how to indicate to me any nervousness or any worry. And then I call a break. I talk to them. If they want, I can actually raise the issue for them. But ideally, I want them to raise the issue themselves, because the power of the employee in their own words and the words they use are often emotionally very compelling. And it's important for the senior leaders to hear those words spoken. In one case, there was a crisis and the senior leader had to go and deal with it and missed consensus day. And it was much more difficult for her to understand the power of consensus day because she wasn't in the room. She's obviously seen the plan, other people told her, but because she wasn't there, it just didn't have the same emotional effect on her.
So what is the outcome of consensus day? So you go in with a list of issues and you go in with a list of what you call the behavioural feedback. But what is the outcome? What do you get out of consensus day?
The outcome is an agreed plan to deal with all of those issues. Every single one.
Every single one.
Yeah. The behavioural data is subcontracted to a smaller group that meets the following day, that also has to be diverse and elected by consensus day. And they get together the following morning. We have all the data on the wall. And until we've ticked off every single piece of data from every workshop, the group of behavioural standards is not finished. And then the briefings of the change plan and the behavioural standards happens at the same time. So usually starting in the afternoon of that second day, the day after consensus day, and then goes through the shifts.
But if something is raised as an issue and prioritised as an issue in one of your all-employee meetings, and then that goes into consensus day with the management team, do you get to the point where the managers can legitimately say, well, I don't see that's an issue, and then it just gets ignored? Or
no.
Go on.
No, they don't get ignored because it's consensus. You can't say it's not an issue when it's been nominated as an issue. And the great advantage of listing the number of workshops that have nominated it is, you know, if one workshop nominated it, it's obviously less of an important issue than, let's say, 30 workshops have nominated.
Part of the act of this then is actually the bringing together of all that information out of those workshops in such a way that it's very clear what the really big issues are.
So what the agenda looks like is it gives quotes without naming the person. It gives quotes. It then states my view of what that issue is, having been present in every single workshop. So there can be different aspects of the same issue. There can be causes and there can be symptoms, but if they're logically connected, they're dealt with as the same issue. We don't want to be solving or trying to solve symptoms when we've got a root cause analysis later on. We want the root cause analysis up front. And the employees are asked to look for root cause, to look for the root cause rather than symptoms.
But you're then bringing all of that into the consensus day, and the specific outcome, or the first thing, is to get a change plan. Okay. So some questions then about that. There'll presumably be a bunch of change initiatives in place already. Does that help hinder those initiatives?
I encourage people to go into a design freeze until they see what comes out, because what comes out could be a lot better than what they were going to implement.
So we've talked about the consensus day and the change plan. So that's then followed on with your behavioural standards. So let's just talk a wee bit more about that.
Well, again, back to the original, right at the beginning of the podcast about frustrations. I spent years and years and years trying to implement corporate value systems, and was very, very frustrated, especially with very senior guys, because very senior guys are intelligent. And if you give them a set of values, they'll interpret the values in such a way that it replicates what they do. Yeah? So you get into Humpty Dumpty conversations about the meaning of words, like blame versus accountability, for example. So in Dupuy in Cork in Ireland, they had a big issue around blame, medical devices, and people were taken off the job and had to prove that they weren't responsible for the quality error to get their job back. So the perception of being found guilty before trial and then having to prove your innocence. And you can imagine the effect that had on the willingness to own up to quality errors and the concealment of errors and all the rest of it. So their first behavioural standard addressed this. So the actual behavioural standard for Dupuy was, when something goes wrong, we ask, what happened? Why did it happen? How do we make sure that doesn't happen again? And we don't ask, who did it? And the transformational effect of the implementation of that behavioural standard on the quality standards in the factory were a major factor in the factory more than doubling its workforce during the 2008-2010 recession.
Okay.
So just think about that. When people were laying off people all over the world, they had to open a second factory and they won the Shingo Prize. So the behavioural standard is a very standards process, and came out of my frustration. And just to give a feel, value standards suffer from positivity bias. They're all positive. In terms of reaching people emotionally and changing behaviour and creating ownership, sometimes stating things negatively is more powerful than stating them positively. So, for example, if you think about the educational revolution in America, they called it the No Child Left Behind program. No Child Left Behind is far more powerful than everybody involved. Part of behavioural standard is understanding which words and which combination of words are more compelling and more emotionally important than others, and creating binary or measurable standards. They're not principles, they're standards. It's not a nice to have.
I suppose this really comes back to another question then, which is, why do culture programs take so long?
They don't. So the example I use was a very big site, 3,000 staff, and a lot of workshops. And it was early on, so there was 72 workshops in total. And I think we'd done 8 to 10 from memory early on. And I was sitting having a cup of tea. The canteen manager approached me with a straight face and a solemn face. And she said, Frank, my staff have asked me to have a word with you. And as a man of a certain age, when a female manager of female staff approaches you and says, my staff have asked me to have a word with you, you can imagine where my brain went and my heart sank. What have I said? Have I upset someone? Anyway, she kept a straight face and she said, the staff have asked me to say to you, whatever you're doing in those workshops, please keep it up. And then she smiled broadly. I thought, she was winding me up. But what had happened was, people going through the tills would often be on their phone, or they'd be talking to other people. So the person serving them was treated almost like a vending machine. Now, when the discussions about respect and how people should treat other people that are inherent in the first workshop when we're talking about behavioral data, people talk about that when they go out. So the conversations they'd had coming out of the workshop with people who hadn't even been yet had already changed the behavior of people going through the till in terms of eye contact, treating their staff better.
So all of this is underlaid by your cathedral higher purpose model, which is all about leadership. And we've done a separate podcast on that, which people
Yes.
can listen to. But just very briefly, just
Yeah.
touch on that and explain how that helps.
Well, it's crucial because the rapid mass engagement process is the leveraging and the aligning of deep employee engagement.
What you're saying is this program of engaging employees requires leadership behavior, and those
Yes.
leadership behaviors aren't widely taught in other leadership development programs.
Yeah. So at theoretical level, conventional leadership development would, in a tick box sense, agree with the foundations of this. But it's the quality and the quantity of those conversations that either support with the cathedral model or accidentally undermine with a lot of the conventional leadership
And
development.
if anybody wants to learn more about that, we've got a separate podcast which we recorded a couple of months ago. So that explains how rapid mass engagement works and the cathedral model that underpins it. We've got a number of standalone questions which we got, which related to all of that.
Okay. Yeah, one of the questions brought up McRaney's book on how we influence people and Sentola's book about how to make big change work. Now, what I would say about both of those books is absolutely what they're saying is valid. So there's no disagreement. The difference is that rapid mass engagement was a very practical application of, yeah, if that's true, what can we do about it to make it work? Both of those books are good books, and the evidence base behind them is very, very valid.
Next question then we had was, can rapid mass engagement work in an organization which is really very, very target driven?
Yeah, I mean, if you think of the areas I mostly work in, and in my whole career has been highly competitive organizations operating in highly competitive markets where there's a real penalty for lack of success. You know, you lose your job, your factory gets closed, etc., etc. Now they, almost by definition, are highly driven by targets. They have to have those targets. The issue is, how do you go about achieving those targets? If you've got an entire workforce that realizes and genuinely that by reaching those targets, this will sustain jobs, this will create jobs in the local community, then you're going to hit those targets. Now, you do have to be intelligent about how you do targets. You drive recognition and improvement and psychological safety by when you are reviewing targets, you don't just focus on the red because it's urgent. You know, you focus on the green. And if you focus on the green within the red, people feel appreciated. They don't feel beaten up. So targets are inevitable, but they enable organizations to reach those targets in a much better way.
Another question, how does rapid mass engagement work in organizations where people feel burnt out or disconnected?
When we talked about the cathedral model of leadership, burnout is in the cathedral model in a way that it's not dealt with anywhere else. I had to invent something called managing overcommitment. If you look at what we do across the world for burnout, is we send people on resilience programs. We say, you've got to be stronger and more resilient to deal with it. And then people don't want to go and work for you. They don't want to be driven into the ground. But if you can get to the root cause of what's causing the burnout and remove that systematically, then the evidence is you actually improve performance without burning people out.
Another couple of questions then. So is this really different to other approaches?
I think if people listen to what we said before, I think it's clear that it is different. Yeah. Now there's aspects, obviously. What I'm not saying is that I've invented everything. Um, the process was testing what's out there, testing the research, keeping and consolidating what did work. So the basis of all of this is research, but interestingly, not just psychology. So neuroscience is incredibly important here, and so is engaging with people for real. The kind of thing David Attenborough did with the gorillas. You know, if an academic psychology person had dealt with the gorillas, they would have sent the gorillas questionnaires about what it was like working in the jungle. But it's far better getting in with the gorillas and letting them scratch you and scratching them, and then you get to know what actually works. And now I'm not suggesting you go around scratching your employees, but the equivalent is genuinely sitting in the canteen, talking to people, playing on the same sports teams as people, and not segregating. When I joined Shell, we had our own toilets, and I used to make a point of going and weeing in the toilets with the ordinary employees in Shell. We had our own dining rooms, this sort of. Now that's gone probably mostly, but the mentality of unnecessary hierarchy and all the rest of it is inherent in this approach.
Yeah. So another question, is rapid mass improvement mainly about improving morale or improving how the system and processes work?
The morale question is similar to the happiness problem. In the pursuit of happiness, what employers often do is they give people lots of stuff. Now, giving people stuff suffers from diminishing returns. It becomes an expectation. Real engagement comes from making meaningful impacts on people's life and their life chances, not pursuing happiness. Happiness, in this sense, comes as a result of, it's not the objective, it comes as a result of achieving amazing things.
Well, so that leads me on to my last question, which is, how do we initiate a national conversation?
That's difficult because it's a differentiation process, not an integration process. There's no logical limit mathematically between doing this in every hospital in the NHS, for example. But you couldn't do it for the NHS because the circumstances in each hospital are different, and the experience of people working in that hospital are very different and have to be reflected, for example, in the behavioural standards, etc., which will be different.
If I understand what you said, you don't change, picking on the NHS, you can't change the whole NHS, but what you can do is you can change one ward or one department. And so the
One
issue,
hospital.
or one hospital.
So I'm not in despair about that. I think it can be done. The problem is the people who could arrange for it to be done themselves are not exposed to this kind of thing, so they're not aware of it. But ultimately, politicians do not think like this.
Well, it's your point, it's your David Attenborough point.
Yes.
The politicians need to go and cuddle up to the gorillas.
Yes, yeah. I'm not anti-politician. There are some very good politicians, but their own life experience often means that they're not exposed to this kind of thinking.
Super. Yeah. All right. So, thank you very much, Frank. Before we go, I think I should just thank people who sent us some
Submitted
questions.
the question.
Thank you very much.